For this video, we will discuss Articles 118 to 121 of the Revised Penal Code. I am referring to the crimes of inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals, violation of neutrality, correspondence with hostile country, and flight to enemy's country. Let's start with Article 118, inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals. The penalty of reclusion temporal shall be imposed upon any public officer or employee, and that of prisión mayor upon any private individual who, by unlawful or unauthorized acts, provokes or gives occasion for a war involving or liable to involve the Philippine Islands or exposes Filipino citizens to reprisals on their persons or property. What are its elements? Number one, the offender here is a private individual or a public officer who performs unlawful or unauthorized acts. Second, such acts of the private individual or public officer provoke or give occasion for a war involving or liable to involve the Philippines or expose our citizens to reprisals on their persons or property. There are two crimes here, the crime of inciting to war and the crime of giving motives for reprisals. Now, these two crimes, lumped under a single article, Article 118, can be committed only in time of peace. And take note that the intention of the offender here is immaterial, for as long as the unlawful or unauthorized acts provoke or give occasion for a war or expose our citizens to reprisals on their persons or property, the crime of either inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals, as the case may be, is thereby deemed committed. For example, the public destruction of the flag or seal of another country. Remember what happened when the Filipina maid in Singapore named Flor Contemplacion died? A lot of Filipinos burned the Singaporean flag. It could have either provoked or gave occasion for a war, or it could have exposed our citizens to reprisals on their persons or property. Remember that there are many Filipinos in Singapore at that time and even now. So, if there were reprisals committed by Singaporean citizens or by the Singaporean government itself against our brother Filipinos living in Singapore at that time, the offenders here who burned the Singaporean flag could be charged under either inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals. Another example is the public manifestation of hostility to the head or ambassador of another country. So these are examples of how a crime under Article 118 can be committed. The crimes of either inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals. Article 119, violation of neutrality. The penalty of prisión correccional shall be inflicted upon anyone who, on the occasion of a war in which the government is not involved, violates any regulation issued by competent authority for the purpose of enforcing neutrality. You just have to remember the elements. Number one, there is a war in which the Philippines is not involved. Okay? The Philippines is not part of that war. No? The Philippines is not at war with any of the country or countries involved in such war. Second, there is a regulation issued by competent authority, the government, for the purpose of enforcing neutrality. And third, the offender violates such regulation. So the main point here is to determine whether or not there is such a regulation, because if there is no such regulation to enforce neutrality, then there can be no violation under this article. Article 120, correspondence with hostile country. Any person who in time of war shall have correspondence with an enemy country or territory occupied by enemy troops shall be punished, number 1, by prisión correccional if the correspondence has been prohibited by the government. Number 2, by prisión mayor if such correspondence be carried on in ciphers or conventional signs. And number 3, by reclusión temporal if notice or information be given thereby which might be useful to the enemy. If the offender intended to aid the enemy by giving such notice or information, then he shall suffer the penalty of reclusión temporal to death. What are the elements of this crime? Number 1, that there is a war in which the Philippines is involved. Number 2, the offender makes correspondence with an enemy country or territory occupied by enemy troops. And number 3, the correspondence is either prohibited by the government or carried on in ciphers or conventional signs or containing notice or information which might be useful to the enemy. Now, with respect to the first element, the war here must be an actual war in which the Philippines is involved. And with respect to the second element, the word correspondence there means communication through letters, yung sulat papel. Or it may refer to the letters which pass between those who have friendly or business relations. So can you just imagine at the time when this provision was enacted by Congress? No? They had no idea at that time that there would be electronic communication. So the question now is, if correspondence is through electronic means, like for example text messaging or through email and the like, does the article apply? It is humbly submitted that the article does not apply because the word correspondence as used in Article 120 should refer only to correspondence via letters or by means of letters. Kung sa Tagalog pa, komunikasyon sa pamamagitan ng sulat papel. Remember that when Article 120 or the Revised Penal Code for that matter was enacted in 1932, there was yet no electronic communication at that time. So how can we now, or why should we now include correspondence through electronic means? When the word correspondence, as I said, referred only to correspondence by means of letters. The phrase or the term prohibited by the government is required only in paragraph 1. It is not required in paragraph 2. It is not required in paragraph 3. And remember that in paragraph 1, the nature of the correspondence is immaterial. Even if the correspondence involves innocent matters only, the prohibition applies. Okay? In paragraph 2, we have there the phrase carried on in ciphers or conventional signs. What does this phrase mean? This means correspondence via a secret or disguised way of writing. So even if there is no prohibition by the government, let's say for example, there is a war in which the Philippines is involved. Even if at that time, there is no prohibition by the government prohibiting its citizens from communicating or from making correspondence with an enemy country through ciphers or conventional signs or by means of ciphers or conventional signs, by express provision of Article 120, any citizen for that matter or resident alien who owes temporary allegiance to our government, who communicates via ciphers or conventional signs to an enemy country will be liable under this paragraph, paragraph number 2. And in paragraph 3, the words notice or information there need not be actually useful to the enemy. What I mean is the notice or information which the offender gives to the enemy country, which might be useful to the enemy, need not be actually useful to the enemy. It is enough that it might be useful to the enemy. it will already make the person who makes such or who gives such notice or information liable under paragraph 3. Also in paragraph 3, the offense becomes qualified, meaning the effect is an increase in the penalty if the offender intended to aid the enemy by the giving of such notice or information. So it is akin to the crime of treason, no? The second way of committing treason in the Revised Penal Code. What is that second way again of committing treason? Adhering to the enemy, giving the enemy aid or comfort. So it is similar, no, to the crime of treason, such that it even has the same penalty as the crime of treason. So the prosecutor can either file a case under Article 120 or he can file a case under treason. I am referring to the second way of committing treason, adhering to the enemy or giving the enemy aid or comfort in such a case. Let's go to Article 121, no, flight to enemy's country. The penalty of arresto mayor shall be inflicted upon any person who, owing allegiance to the government, attempts to flee or go to an enemy country when prohibited by competent authority. What are its elements? There is a war in which the Philippines is involved, meaning to say this is committed only in time of war. The offender owes allegiance to the government, and the offender flees or attempts to flee to the enemy country. Those are the elements, no? So it's very easy to remember. There is a war in which the Philippines is involved, the offender owes allegiance to the government, and the offender flees or attempts to flee to enemy country. And going to the enemy country is prohibited by competent authority. That is the fourth element. The allegiance here means either permanent or temporary allegiance. Hence, this article applies even to a resident alien, because a resident alien, if you remember, in our discussion in treason, owes what? Temporary or qualified allegiance to the government or the country in which he is a resident. But if the resident alien attempts to flee or flees to enemy country, which happens to be his own country, to which he owes permanent allegiance to, then it is submitted that he should not be held liable because he is expected, no, to be loyal to his own country, no, the country of his citizenship, the country of his origin, not to the country to which he only owes temporary or qualified allegiance. And of course, he must be allowed, no, to go back to his own country.